and welcome to Dialogue. Senior Chinese policymakers gathered in Beijing for the annual Central Economic Work Conference to map out economic and reform plans for the next year. How will China boost its economy after 3 years of strict COVID policies? What are the industries facing the greatest challenges? And what are the economic targets for 2023? To discuss these issues and more, I'm glad to be joined today by Wang, Chief Economist of Hang Seng Bank, joining us from Shanghai, Professor Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, joining us from Tel Aviv, Israel, and Anthony Chen, former JPMorgan Chase Chief Economist, joining us from Honolulu, Hawaii. That's our topic. I'm Li Xin, sitting in for Xu Qingduo. So the warmest welcome to all of our guests to Dialogue. Let me go to Wang Dan first. Taking into consideration the economic plans that were laid out at the 20th CPC National Congress in October, and re-emphasis on economic recovery from COVID, what kind of practical strategies do you think is necessary to revitalize the economy?
Well, we have already seen some signals coming out from the Politburo meeting, and we're expecting more clear details with the macroeconomic policies. The main thing that people will be watching is whether there will be a GDP growth target for 2023. Because right now, the economic confidence has been at a low point for a rather long time. So if there can truly be an economic target around 5% or even higher, it's going to be a major boost for the market confidence. And then there will be also more talks on the monetary expansion along with fiscal policies and how that can come out while boosting the domestic demand will be a key issue for the central meeting. And then on top of all that, there's also the housing issue. It's going to be the main driver for 2023. So everybody is anxious to see whether there will be some reversal of the policies on the demand side and on the supply side.
Okay, we'll elaborate on that in just a moment. But John, what would you say are the key issues policymakers must focus on at this moment to try to get Chinese economy back on track?
Well, even though the zero COVID policy appears to be behind us, I think the COVID situation is not entirely behind us at this point, even though we understand that it's not as lethal, it's not as killing as it used to be. I think we're still seeing a lot of infections in cities like in Beijing and Shanghai, even though, as I said, it's like a cold right now. But even given that, I think given this current situation, I think the most important issue right now is to address the consumption issue, is an unemployment issue. Even we talk about growth next year. I think in the next few weeks, we're still going to see these numbers going up. People are unlikely to come out and open up their wallets in a big way as we would expect out of a pandemic, because it's not entirely over yet. So I think unemployment and consumption are the two key issues at this point. And I think there's still things that the central government, the municipal governments can do. And I know in some municipal governments are already doing something like this, for example, issuing coupons, social risk consumptions. These are the priorities right now. I think we're talking about, really trying to help those millions of people out there have been hit for so long. For some people, it's over a year right now. Practically no job, no income for such a long period of time. And I think these people need really help. So I think even we talk about economic growth, I think the priority right now is to essentially help people being heavily hit by the pandemic.
Okay, before we talk more about the measures needed to rescue the economy, but exactly what is the shape of the economy? Because although 3 years we try to battle the virus, and I'm going to pose this question to Wang Dan because this is more about China's economic health. we spent 3 years trying to press this virus down. At the same time, China's economy still fared reasonably well, especially when it compared to other countries that adopted other measures to battle the virus. What is the state of health of the Chinese economy at this moment?
Well, the economic growth rate in the past 3 years averaged 4.5%, but most of growth happened in 2020 and then gradually slowed down. And this year, we're facing the most challenging time since COVID has started. Many of the small businesses have their liquidity dried up because the demand side of the economy hasn't been able to revive due to a depressed consumer market. And then in terms of investment, the housing market has been in its worst recession since 1990s. So I would say at this point, the domestic demand side is in pretty bad shape. But when it comes to production, there are more things to be optimistic about. The supply chain is still quite strong. In fact, after the COVID has started, the global dependence on China had in fact increased rather than decreased. And we're expecting more foreign investment coming in despite of the prolonged COVID control. So in 2023, the economic health will certainly be better than this year, especially in consumption, but still a lot more work has to be done in order to boost domestic investment.
Anthony, let me come to you. First of all, after 3 years of living with the dynamic zero COVID approach, China has finally loosened its prevention measures and its control measures, taking one step closer to becoming fully open. How has the US or the international markets reacted to this new strategy so far? And what kind of predictions are you seeing about China's economic outlook going forward with a new living with COVID approach?
I think if you see the reaction of the financial markets, you've seen that the equity markets, stocks of Chinese stocks traded in Hong Kong out there are showing dramatic improvement. So the rest of the world is very encouraged to see the reopening in the sense that it will promote economic growth. But I think if you look at the experience of both the European economy and, of course, the US economy, when you get the reopening initially, you do face some real challenges because infections do go up. You're seeing that certainly in Shanghai, certainly that in Beijing. You saw that in Hong Kong to some extent. So you're going to see some challenges in the immediate period, as Professor John and Wang has mentioned, because these are the things that happen when you automatically open. Now, I am encouraged that China is going to be allowing some of the antivirals used around the world to battle the disease. I'm also encouraged by the fact that locally they're going to encourage vaccinations. I would hope that they would also encourage all types of vaccines into the country so that the more the better, so that they can fight this disease. I'm also encouraged by some of the things that I'm hearing from the government that they're going to encourage dual circulation. That means that encourage more consumption. But the main problem and threat right now, as Professor John has mentioned, is battling this disease. That was the same situation in the United States, in Europe, and around the world, that unless you are able to effectively and successfully battle this virus, the economy will continue to be held hostage.
What do you mean?
Virus.
What do you mean successfully battle this virus? I mean, from the experience of United States, what is the definition of successfully battling the virus and the implication on the economy, Anthony?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward, and that is you want to see that the consumers, the people living in the country, are believing that the risk to them is much reduced or manageable, so they can go and start to visit the mall, start to go out into restaurants. Until that happens, you're not going to be able to see the goals that the Chinese government has, and that is to encourage domestic consumption because people will be simply too scared. This is not something I'm predicting for China necessarily, but I'm telling you that this is exactly what happened in Europe. This is exactly what happened in the United States. Until people are confident enough to go back into the economy, you're not going to see the type of GDP that we would like. It is very exciting. I'm hoping that the targeted growth rate is over, it's 5% or better, because it certainly sends a strong signal. But unless the people are confident, they won't go out there in such strength to justify those numbers.
How long did it take, for instance, in the case of the United States? I understand states took different rhythm, let's say. Some took longer, some took shorter, but overall, do you have a gauge of how long it took for the US consumers to feel confident enough in general to go out and consume?
In the United States, we saw that in different parts of the country, you saw different reactions. We, of course, in the United States are very polarized politically. So you have some states where they opened up a lot quicker. There you saw challenges initially, but then the economy recovered. And those that were a little bit more reluctant opened up a lot more slowly. And so you saw the economies there in the so-called blue states recovering a little bit more slowly. But the key is that in the United States and in Europe, many of the governments certainly introduce a ton of medical solutions to the problem. And so I am very encouraged that in China, they're now encouraging people not only to get the vaccine, but to get boosters. So to the extent that that happens, I'm going to be a lot more optimistic, but it's still going to take, months, not weeks, to get through this process.
Well, then now the CPC Central Committee and the State Council recently issued a guideline to accelerate domestic demand and promote the formation of a strong strategic market in China. And that is known as the Strategic Plan for Expanding Domestic Demand. It will upgrade China's consumption and investment scale and establish what it calls a complete internal demand system. What is your takeaway from the plan? Do you think that plan, of course, is a much longer term strategy, but looking at the immediate plan for the next year, for instance, do you think what Anthony just talked about, is that factored into the planning of the Chinese economic policy for the coming year?
Boosting domestic demand certainly will be key in order to revive the economy in 2023. But if we're looking at the guideline that's issued recently by the central government, it's mainly about what's going to happen in the next 5 years instead of 1 year. Because in order to boost the consumption, as we know, it is a function of income. We need to figure out a way to increase income for average household first. But with the restructuring on the corporate sector just starting, we will see more layoffs actually in the coming months before things get better. And people will get more conservative in their spending during the meantime. So comparing China to the situation in Europe or the US might not be justified, since they don't really have the control. Those countries didn't have the control in the beginning. They just let people have more freedom very early on. But if we compare mainland China with Hong Kong, the situation might be more clear. People tend to start spending after 6 months when the restrictions were lifted. So we might be expecting more willingness to spend around the second quarter next year. And if the macro policy can use some of the measures to transfer cash to families in China, I believe this domestic demand would recover a lot sooner.
John, what is your takeaway from maybe not the long-term strategy, but the plan for next year, for the year 2023? Do you think the policymakers have taken full consideration of the time it's going to take to people gather their confidence to go out and shop and consume?
Yeah, you mentioned the word confidence. I think it's absolutely important. Currently the market sentiment, the consumer confidence, the investor confidence are all at an all-time low, in my view. We need some time and some policy measures to beef up this confidence. The government can only do certain things to the extent of helping consumers to spend, open up their wallets. But it's in my view, it's a very limited impact. As a matter of fact, I always had this heated debate with my good friend at Beijing University, Yao Yao. He's been advocating, directly giving checks to people for for them to spend. And then you know always about his position. I have a slightly different opinion about this. I think the effect of this is going to be very limited. It's going to be short-term in nature. Ultimately, it's all about economic activities, about growth, about jobs being created. These are the more fundamental things that the government has to do. And what we mean by that is that it has to introduce things on the fiscal side to stimulate investment, to somehow assuage people's concern about investor confidence about in the private sector. The investment money has to come back. The confidence among the foreign companies operating in China, they have to continue to invest. These are the things that ultimately are going to take an effect on consumption. But of course, the things that I'm talking about are more of a long-term in nature. You're not going to feel this effect within the next, say, month or two. It's going to take some time. But I think, but again, I want to emphasize that these are fundamental things that really drive consumption. In the short run,
what I read, which just came out of this Central Economic Work meeting, for instance, is that the government is advocating a stronger, a more forceful, active fiscal policy, and that the monetary policy needs to be more forceful and more targeted. Again, for this question, I'm going to go to Wang Dan. Do you think this is the right signal that's sent out, or they are using their hammer where it's needed the most?
This is absolutely crucial. The market has been expecting more monetary expansion along with fiscal expansion. This year, throughout the second half, it's mainly the infrastructure spending that were bolstering growth. But throughout next year, the understanding is the fiscal side has very little room because whatever needed to be built already being built, and the fiscal budget cannot be extended much further. And it's debatable whether the government can issue more debt to finance more infrastructure spending. But it is quite important that there has to be more state-backed funds in order to revive the housing market, because the commercial markets simply don't have the liquidity. And in terms of money expansion, it's even more important because when the economy is in this recovery mode, businesses need more money. And the banking sector has to be able to provide liquidity whenever necessary. And now we're expecting more of lowering the policy rate rather than the narrowly targeted approach to industries.
So to put it in simpler terms, they are doing the right things at this right moment. Is that what you're saying, Wang Dan?
Correct. This is the right signal, and the market has to hear it. And it is exactly what the central government is doing.
Okay. Anthony, what is your take of the kind of measures that are being implemented, that are being rolled out, and the kind of emphasis, for instance, they're emphasizing supporting the housing market, supporting new energy, automobile, old people, service industry, and so on and so forth. And of course, the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. From your perspective, are these the right measures to be taken at this particular moment?
Well, at this time, what you see in China is that there is a lack of demand. So you do need to stimulate demand. And the good news is, as Wang Dan has indicated, that monetary policy in China certainly has more room than certainly anything you see in other countries, whether it's Europe or the United States, because the Chinese inflation rate is below 3% or in the 3% range. In the United States, of course, the inflation rate is in the 7% range. So monetary policy has to be restrictive. In China, there's room for expansionary monetary policy. That will certainly provide the liquidity that small businesses need to minimize layoffs that Professor John has talked about. In fact, stabilize employment. These are all things that are absolutely needed. With regard to fiscal policy, we know that back in 2020, one of the reasons why the Chinese economy was so resilient is because they continued to expand fiscal policy back in 2020. And my suspicion is that even though there may be limited room, that they will continue to to encourage small increases in the deficit to stimulate the overall economy. But again, all these things are going to be helpful, but as Professor John has indicated, if you don't get confidence from businesses, from consumers, these measures will be helpful, but will not be sufficient to turn the economy around towards the targeted growth rates.
Yeah, what is a very useful tool from your understanding for the Chinese market, for the Chinese situation, to boost people's confidence in a relatively short period of time?
Well, I think it's very obvious. The most useful strategy would be for the government to somehow try to lower the number of infections and control the growth of COVID to levels that both businesses and consumers feel comfortable again to go re-enter the economy. That's obviously easier said than done, because that's something that the medical authorities and the central government have control over, but that is going to be the crucial factor. I am confident that as they attack this COVID situation on all fronts, even though they're reopening, but again, to prevent the widespread nature of this disease, or at least to control it, hopefully herd immunity, that if enough people get infected, they become immune, and those that are not infected to get the Chinese vaccines and the Western antivirals that are being introduced. All these factors, I think, will play an important role in supporting confidence that Professor John has talked about.
Professor Gong, right now, things are not like what people see in the news, in their news. For instance, China is not opening up immediately everywhere at the same time. We do see a kind of staggered wave, let's say, of infections, first in surrounding cities of Beijing, and slowly it's rippling towards other cities, and before it reaches more remote areas. That seems to me to be the situation. So how significant is that going to be for the stability of the Chinese economy, John? Is that a very important factor?
Absolutely, this is critically important. When I talk about business confidence, of course, I'm also talking about confidence among foreign investors as well. I mean, if you look at the infection numbers going up right now in major cities in China, I would imagine that these numbers are increasing, even though we haven't really seen the statistics yet. It's very difficult to collect, and we'll probably stop collecting these statistics. But I'm just imagining, I'm hypothesizing that these numbers are increasing probably even faster than major cities around the world. And if that's the case, what's the point of requiring quarantines for inbound flights for 5 days, 3 days? It just doesn't make sense anymore. I think one of the things we have to realize is that over the last 3 years, I think many local governments in China have really introduced some, in my view, excessive and over-restrictive policies, whether with respect to domestic citizens as well as businesses and foreign companies. And I think these things are really hurting investor confidence. And I think we have to roll back these measures. And I think it's about time to roll back these measures as the economy opens up.
Yeah, John, sorry for interrupting there. I understand the reason why China is not opening up international travel fully is it does not want to be flooded by infections at this moment, so that the hospitals will be completely overwhelmed. That is my understanding. But my question is really on the economic side. Is that going to give China some leeway, some room to ride over the first wave so their confidence can slowly pick up? Because you cannot have the entire country paralyzed by the virus all at once.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it is a timing issue. The government, the central government, is prepared with a dose of a stimulation, basically, right? So when do you pull that trigger? Now, in my view, I think Anthony made this point very clear. We are going to see several weeks at least. He talks about months. I hope it's not going to be months. I hope it's going to be several weeks of this rapid numbers going up and people not going to open up their wallets. So I think it's a time issue. I would rather see the government wait a little bit longer before they pull this trigger. And I think we're probably going to see a massive amount of stimulus both in terms of monetary as well as fiscal policies sometime next year. And I think the timing is extremely important.
Wang Dan, in terms of international investment, John mentioned, of course, his opinion is that the measures, the dynamic zero, proved to be quite harsh for some joint ventures, for some foreign businesses here in China. But on the other hand, foreign investment never stopped coming in. Actually, foreign investors continue to invest quite substantively in China over the past 3 years for some of the reasons you mentioned. So in terms of foreign business investment, how much can they look forward to in the coming months and year?
For foreign businesses, they were enduring the same level of hardship as domestic businesses during COVID and during especially the Shanghai lockdown. The language issue has become very difficult barrier for a lot of the foreign workers in China. But in terms of the business hardships, they were not taking more than the domestic ones. I want to make that point. And in terms of future opportunities, a lot of foreign companies are now waiting for a clear sign that the Chinese consumers are ready to come out again. And for especially foreign investors in the consumer sector, now the consensus is China's retail market will rebound quite strongly in the second half of 2023. And when that happens, we will see a flooding of foreign investments again, maybe initially slowly, but over time, it's going to restore quite quickly. There's never a sense that China has lost its charm as the world's largest single market. But in manufacturing, especially in advanced manufacturing, in electronics, equipment making, especially in the semiconductor industry, there's a higher sense of diversification away from China. And that process has started because people want to reduce the risk, both from the geopolitical perspective and also COVID perspective.
All right. Anthony, in terms of foreign investments, what is your observation and what should they be doing at this moment, watching what is happening in China?
Well, I'm encouraged that the government has talked about creating a gravitational field or pull to encourage foreign investment, because for many years, some foreign companies have not been clear whether or not they would be as welcome as the numbers or the perception might indicate. But now for the central government to actually state very clearly that they're going to not only encourage domestic growth and consumption, but also encourage foreign companies to come to China, I think that is encouraging. And that is encouraging because we have seen, as Wang Dan has indicated, some diversification of the supply chain. So to offset that, you certainly need the government to encourage foreign direct investment and companies to come and relocate in China. Okay. So it's very encouraging.
All right. Well, fingers crossed. Many thanks to Wang Dan, Professor John Gong, and Anthony Chen. We come to the end of this edition of Dialogue. I'm Li Xin in Beijing, sitting in for Xu Qingzhuo. Thank you very much on behalf of the whole team for watching us.